Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
The world has now had a week to get used to President Trump. From the inauguration last Friday to today's press conference with Theresa May. Everyone knew they'd have to take him seriously. Is it now time we also took him literally?
I think a lot of the voters who vote for Trump take Trump seriously, but not literally.
It's going to be only America first. America first.
People took him seriously. The press never did. They took him literally. That's what I'm trying to say is, the essence of what he was about was, I'm going to change. And whether it was building a wall, which, you really, I'm not so sure that that's really what's going to happen.
We'll begin immediate construction of a border wall.
And supporters took him seriously, but not literally.
Does it work? Does torture work? And the answer is yes, absolutely.
Tonight, a specially extended Newsnight exploring the first 7 days of Donald Trump's presidency and what they have meant for the world. Just over 12 months ago, the British Parliament debated banning Donald Trump from this country in response to the perceived toxicity of his electioneering rhetoric. Today, the British Prime Minister, who as Home Secretary described some of that rhetoric as divisive, unhelpful and wrong, arrived in Washington and invited him to come here on a state visit. Indeed, at a joint press conference just a few hours ago, both were keen to portray the beginning of a beautiful friendship. But she mentioned the so-called special relationship 8 times in a speech to Republican politicians yesterday, while today Trump's White House managed to misspell her name 3 times in official documentation. So just how special is that relationship? And just how much of a political risk is Theresa May taking by swallowing any personal distaste and hoping that a president who delights in bellowing America first might somehow be persuaded to put Britain second? Newsnight's David Grossman was watching.
How presidents and prime ministers interact matters. A great deal of effort goes into making sure they hit it off. Some relationships, however, barely register. Others become central to both. Into which category this latest iteration will fall, well, today we began to find out. Nothing was allowed to get in the way, not even the Oval Office lamp. An executive order and it was gone. Back in the room, though, the bust of Churchill.
This is the original. This is the original in many ways.
After a private meeting in the Oval Office, a press conference where the compliments really flowed.
Today, the United States renews our deep bond with Britain, military, financial, cultural, and political. We have one of the great bonds. We pledge our lasting support to this most special relationship.
I'm delighted to be able to congratulate you on what was a stunning election victory. And as you say, the invitation is an indication of the strength and importance of the special relationship that exists between our two countries, a relationship based on the bonds of history, of family, kinship and common interests.
But the positivity was rather interrupted by the questions from reporters, 2 picked by the President and 2 by Mrs May.
Mr. President, you've said before that torture works. You've praised Russia. You've said you want to ban some Muslims from coming to America. You've suggested there should be punishment for abortion.
This was your choice of a question.
There goes that relationship.
It's 205 years since the British set fire to the White House. Theresa May had been advised to do something similar today. Instead, her softer approach appeared to achieve results, reassurance on Europe's key military alliance.
On defence and security cooperation, we're united in our recognition of NATO as the bulwark of our collective defence. And today, we've reaffirmed our unshakable commitment to this alliance. Mr. President, I think you confirmed that you're 100% behind NATO.
Mr. Trump also said it was too early to talk about dropping sanctions on Russia. On torture, Mr. Trump is on record as saying that he thinks that it works. But crucially, he said, his new Defense Secretary, General James Mattis, does not.
I don't necessarily agree, but I would tell you that he will override because I'm giving him that power. He's an expert. He's highly respected. He's the general's general.
And there was, of course, the inevitable question on personal chemistry.
The hard-working daughter of a vicar, the brash TV extrovert. Have you found anything in common personally yet?
Actually, I'm not as brash as you might think. And I can tell you that I think we're going to get along very well. You know, it's interesting because I am a people person. I think you are also, Teresa. And I can often tell how I get along with somebody very early, and I believe we're going to have a fantastic relationship.
However, the president's people-judging powers did rather let him down when he tried to hold the Prime Minister's hand as he walked her to her car. Aside from a little awkwardness, both sides will have been happy with today.
David Grossman reporting there. Our political editor Nick Watt was, of course, watching that press conference today, and he joins me now. Will they be having a small glass of sherry, do you think, in Theresa May's camp this evening?
Well, to put it simply, they are ecstatic. This visit was fraught with risks for Theresa May because there were many Tories who were saying she was rushing over to Washington too soon after the inauguration of President Trump. But in number 10, they are pointing to two big gains. In the first place, that commitment, according to Theresa May, from Donald Trump, that he's 100% behind NATO. It's not that long ago, only a few weeks ago, that he said that NATO is obsolete in its current form, though crucially, she did say that NATO will have to meet Donald Trump's two concerns. One, everyone's got to pay their fair share, and secondly, it's got to be reconfigured to tackle terrorism. And the second big gain they're taking from Donald Trump is big support for a UK-US free trade agreement. But interestingly, those two big gains were voiced by Theresa May and not by Donald Trump.
So her tactics then have done the job in the short term, but not necessarily delivering in the long term?
Well, I mean, Theresa May is essentially doing what every UK Prime Minister since Harold Wilson and Jim Callaghan has done, which is to get close to the US President. But she says that she's doing it in her way and giving herself some wriggle room. She believes that Tony Blair perhaps appeared to write a blank cheque for George Bush after 9/11. So, for example, on Russia, she made clear she disagrees with Donald Trump and thinks that sanctions should still remain in place. He was non-committal on that, but Kellyanne Conway, his advisor this afternoon, was saying maybe the US will be lifting sanctions. And interestingly, think of what she got on NATO. Essentially, Donald Trump has given that commitment, and she's able to say to EU partners and NATO partners in Europe who have doubts about whether the UK's heading off to the US, and these people, Merkel and Hollande, are struggling to get an in with Trump. She's able to say, look, I got a commitment that he's 100% behind it. But key thing about the special relationship, you may do well on the substance, but in the end, it is decided often on the optics. And what will be the abiding memory of this visit?
Shall we?
Shall we? The handshake,
yes, the
holding
hand-holding.
hands.
Thank you very much indeed, Nick Watt. Dr. Leslie Vinger-Maury is an expert in the transatlantic partnerships. This must be professionally quite a fraught time for you.
It is a fraught time.
What is the transatlantic partnership?
What is it? I mean, it's been an interesting visit today, hasn't it? And it was a fraught. It was a meeting that could have gone very badly. But I think that it's exactly right to say the optics and the symbolism of this visit have so far seemed to be very important. And the transatlantic relationship, I mean, what is it? It's a commitment. It has historically been a commitment by the U.S. and the United Kingdom to promoting and securing the liberal international order. And this is exactly what everybody's been worried about, that Donald Trump is walking back in very dramatic and significant ways from the liberal international order.
And therein lies Theresa May's risk, that she appeared to be talking about globalism, talking about upholding the liberal international order at a time when Donald Trump seemed to be running away from it at a rate of knots.
That's right. And so not only was the press conference interesting, but it's notable that last night when she spoke to the Republicans, she made a real point of saying that the United States and the United Kingdom would work together to promote democracy. They wouldn't do it by intervening in the internal affairs of other states. But nonetheless, it was a global agenda. It was a liberal agenda. It wasn't a limited agenda.
Well, it was a global agenda in one sense. In another sense, the American media seemed a lot keener to ask questions about Mexico and Russia than they did about the other half of the so-called special relationship.
Yes, that's right. I mean, there are all sorts of issues. And again, the question now, though, I think that we need to remember is that, You know, Donald Trump was very respectful, but there's a sense in which you always think that maybe he's humoring whoever he's speaking to, and the rubber hits the road in the days and the weeks to come. Will the special relationship really mean very much to Donald Trump? Very hard to know.
I mean, in the great scheme of things, for all his sort of Scottish ancestry and what have you, how high up on his to-do list will be giving Britain something?
I do think that Donald Trump is committed to a U.S.-UK bilateral trade deal. What that actually amounts to is minuscule compared to what Theresa May really needs to secure from her European partners. But at the end of the day, Donald Trump has a set of priorities, and very few of them have a lot to do with the UK, right? So we have to watch this space.
Thank you very much indeed, Leslie Binja-Mori. Joining me now is the Conservative MEP, and you get described as this all the time, don't you? Arch-Brexiteer, Dan Hannan. He's with me in the studio. This wasn't really in the script, was it? All these wonderful new freedoms, the liberation that follows from shrugging off the shackles of Brussels, and the first thing the Prime Minister does is break bread with a self-proclaimed protectionist.
Well, with a view to getting a trade deal between the largest and the fifth largest economies on the planet, which will be of huge benefit to both. You know, there's 1 million Brits every day who turn up to work for American companies, 1 million Americans who work for British companies. We're the single biggest investor there, they're the single biggest investor here. The only thing that hasn't followed up until now has been the trade, because the trade has been controlled by Brussels rather than by us. And that can now change. And there are, as far as I can see, there are almost no losers and there are a lot of winners, including, by the way, our European allies.
So glass three-quarters full for you then on this one. Are you worried about any of the sort of slightly less savoury elements of the election campaign and seeing the British Prime Minister essentially post-Brexit having to go there and make friendly noises?
I was not a Trump supporter, but...
Are you now?
No, look, I mean, it seems to me that the only proper attitude for a friend of America and a friend of American democracy is to say, you've made your decision and this remains a powerful alliance. And
whoever's in the White House?
Well, as long as America remains committed to the values of the West, then this is our one key alliance. It has been since 1941, you know. And
you mentioned 1941. He seems, we haven't got the detail of the executive order yet, but it looks as though he may have signed a ban on refugees on Holocaust Remembrance Day. How does that play with Western values?
There were all sorts of aspects of his platform that I disliked, and there are lots of things that, you know, as I say, I wouldn't have voted for the guy. And I don't resile from any of the things I said about him. But Theresa May's job is not to go and lecture him and wag her finger. Her job is to get the best deal for us, and by implication, the best deal for the broader community of Western countries. And I think she did that today. She came out with this commitment on NATO, which will have delighted the Europeans. She slightly softened his position on the issue of sanctions on Russia. She hasn't just gone and played a kind of subordinate role at all. It's very clear that there's give and take. She's established her own vision of what the special relationship can be. And she's made relationships, by the way, not just with him. I mean, the US is a system with a divided government, and she's got very good relations with, you know... But she
saw an awful lot in a very short press conference, Dan, isn't it?
Well, but she's been there also meeting, you know, the other leaders in Congress and so on. And this is going to be a key relationship, and it's bigger than any two leaders, you know.
Do you buy this conflation that's abroad now of Brexit with Trump, this claim by some that without Brexit there would be no Trump, and given, of course, your, as you say, your established rejection of much of what he said and stood for in the election campaign, do you feel, as the arch-Brexiteer, a degree of responsibility?
No, I think the parallel has been greatly overdone. I mean, a big part of Donald Trump's appeal, as I understand it, was that he didn't want free trade with China. Whereas you'll remember a big part of Vote Leave's argument was that we do want free trade with China. We can't get it while we're in the EU. So Brexit has a globalist and internationalist flavour that I don't think was there. The one thing they had in common, I'll concede this, was an anger against what was perceived to be a failed governing class. But I think it would be a mistake to see Brexit as being nativist or protectionist. I think it's much more about re-engagement with the wider world.
So, that said, do you think maybe there should have been a little bit of finger-wagging behind closed doors?
Well, I've no idea what happened behind closed doors.
But from
what I can only infer from what was said in front of those doors afterwards. And, you know, it was the issues that people had concerns about, NATO, Russia sanctions and so on, he seems slightly to have softened his position on.
I accept that you are not as enthusiastic about drawing the two together as some other Brexiteers are. Do you think the world's a safer place now that Donald Trump is in the White House?
Like I say, he wasn't my preferred candidate, but I think the world is a safer place when the English-speaking democracies work together for the rule of law.
The English-speaking democracies?
Yeah, I think the alliance between the United Kingdom and the United States has been a far greater guarantor of human freedom and happiness than anybody really likes to admit for the last 100 years. Imagine the world without it. You know, we think of these universal values now of free speech and equality for women and democracy. You know, there'd have been nothing universal about them if the Second World War had ended differently or if the Cold War had ended differently. And we should remember the value of that alliance and what it's done not just for us but for the other countries.
The alliance that was already extant, as opposed to any new sort of form of alliance.
But she has.
I just want to direct your view. I just want to direct your view to continental Europe, if I may. And one of the independent candidate for the French presidency said today that Britain lived in equilibrium with Europe. This is Emmanuel Macron, but now it is becoming a vassal state, meaning it is becoming the junior partner of the United States. We've gone from being a big player.
I mean, the absurdity of that is that the European Union is about political integration. It's about turning the countries into something bigger, a political union, whereas no country in the world is more jealous of its sovereignty than the United States. The idea that this could be other than an alliance of democracies, and I hope, by the way, one that goes wider, that brings in other friendly countries, the idea that we'd somehow be drawn into a political union with the United States.
English-speaking, or would we allow non-English speakers into
and all friendly countries, you know, but you know, there's so much virtue signalling, including from some British politicians who are indulging themselves by signalling their distaste for this or that aspect of Donald Trump's domestic policy.
But they might just feel distaste.
Well,
they might not
maybe
be
they do.
signaling.
Do you know what? But if they were Prime Minister and they were not engaging with the world's largest economy and our most important military ally, there would be a serious dereliction of their duty.
Daniel Hannan, thank you very much indeed. It would, however, seem that the spokespeople and cheerleaders who spent much of last year insisting that Trump should be taken seriously but not literally, or even that we should stop listening to his actual words and focus instead on what was in his heart, are going to need some new catchphrases. For within days of assuming office, Trump has signed executive orders addressing, inter alia, pre-election pledges about banning refugees from some Muslim countries and building that wall on the Mexican border. Newsnight's diplomatic editor, Mark Urban, has been considering just how significant those signatures may prove to be.
Last Friday's inauguration speech, followed by the dispute over how many had actually attended, heralded something loud and clear. From early morning tweets to abusive rivals, presidential Trump is no different from campaign trail Trump. The idea of repealing Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, has been touted many times on the campaign trail, and it's an area where the president and Republican lawmakers can agree in principle. But signing off on his first executive order, Trump couldn't scrap Obamacare at one stroke. That would leave 20 million Americans uncovered, and there's no consensus about what should follow.
Republicans have thought about the alternative to the Affordable Care Act for some time, but they haven't necessarily agreed on what the policy is. So I think there has to be some agreement around the policy, and then the timing and the sequencing and all of that has to come into play. I've always thought this would be at least a several-month process.
In some areas, for example on resuming waterboarding, the news has not been quite what it seems.
When ISIS is doing things that nobody has ever heard of since medieval times, would I feel strongly about waterboarding? As far as I'm concerned, we have to fight fire with fire. Now,
in an ABC interview on Wednesday, President Trump said he believed torture works, but it's clear that his defense secretary and CIA director oppose it.
Well, I think that he is communicating what he thinks voters feel, what he feels himself. At the same time, that is different than the U.S. government actually establishing and implementing a policy. And we heard the opposite also from the defense secretary during his confirmation hearing process, Jim Mattis, saying he has more success with a can of beer and a pack of cigarettes than anyone would by using enhanced interrogation.
And if that's uncertain, what about the Mexican wall? It's a key campaign promise, but paying for it is proving highly contentious. First, the Mexican president cancelled a planned visit over that question. Then President Trump talked about using a 20% import tariff. But legislation looks inevitable. It can't be done simply by executive order.
The issue now is, can he rule by executive order? And I think there are some real constraints on that. And the first constraint is obviously Congress itself, which can actually legislate to stop him using executive orders if it wants. But more importantly, anything that Donald Trump sits in his office and signs, Congress will have the power to either fund or not fund.
And then there's the government machine. Draft executive orders have already leaked. New White House staffers bad-mouthed each other, and civil servants been tweeting subversively.
I am sure that in the federal workforce, there are a lot of people who are very unhappy about Trump's election and will provide some kind of passive or active resistance to his leadership. There's no question about that. I really hope that people don't do that or that they get over it. It's everyone's duty. I was a career Foreign Service officer. It's everyone's duty to try to make the administration that you are working for as successful as possible for the good of the country.
For the moment, just 1 week in, Trump still has plenty of political momentum. But with so many executive orders, uncertainty as to how they'll work, a suspicious Congress, and few appointees in place, the complications have already started to multiply.
In a moment, we'll be talking to the foreign affairs expert, Anne Applebaum. But before that, joining me now from Florida is the veteran Republican political strategist Roger Stone, himself a long-term confidant of Donald Trump. Mr. Stone, everybody was waiting for a pivot. They were waiting for the old phrase, we campaign in poetry and govern in prose. There isn't going to be one, is there?
No, nor is there going to be any honeymoon. Look, Donald Trump is exactly what he appears to be. He is his own man. He is not going to fit into some stricture designed by others. And I believe as long as he continues to implement his agenda and make progress on the big issues, these small kerfuffles over his Twitter feed and the size of the press and his correct, in my view, criticism of the media really won't matter. What matters to the American people are results.
Okay, let me pick you up on that first point about him being his own man who isn't going to sort of try and fit into anybody else's worldview. How does that square with what he said about torture and fitting in with James Mattis's worldview?
I'm sorry, I couldn't understand your question.
You said he will be his own man and he won't allow himself to be moulded by anybody else's views or ideas, and yet the first thing he said in the press conference today was that he's allowed James Mattis to remould the attitude to torture. He's not going to be his own man on torture. He's going to follow the lead of his defence secretary.
Well, first of all, he has to do what is both legal and constitutional, regardless of what his personal views are. I understand his disgust at the tactics of ISIS, and I think he's trying to signal that he will do everything he can to crush ISIS. At the same time, he, just like every other president, has to follow the law. General Mattis is a good man. He knows what he's doing. I think he's wise to follow his lead.
So where are we then? Is there going to be torture under a Trump administration, or isn't there, do you think? Knowing what you know of Donald Trump.
I think he will push the limits legally and constitutionally. He wants to get as tough on ISIS as he can. But at the end of the day, he's still got to abide by the law.
And the sort of law of truth as well. I mean, you are a veteran of the dark arts of politicking. You seem to revel in the rascalish nature of the profession. So when, for example, you put it out that Ted Cruz's father was involved in the assassination of John F. Kennedy, one imagines you doing it with a wry smile and a sort of thumbs up to the gallery. Donald Trump has a slightly different relationship with the truth. But when he spoke today at the press conference about being in Scotland the day before Brexit, the calendar in his own Twitter account reveals that he didn't get there until the day after. Does he in his own mind believe it when he says these things, even though all of the evidence contradicts him?
I think there's some poetic license there. But yes, I am committed to the truth. And therefore, the canard that the Russians hacked our election, which is completely and totally unproven, and for which our intelligence services have provided no evidence.
Which is why I haven't asked you about it. I've asked you about the stuff that has happened on the record. today.
Well,
so when he says that he was in
Yes,
Scotland
go
on the
ahead.
day that the result came in, and I beg your pardon, the day before the result came in, and he predicted it all, and then his own Twitter account reveals that he landed in Scotland the day after, does he believe it when he says it?
Now, perhaps he was mistaken. Do you think any voter really cares? I don't think they care.
No, I'm interested in whether or not
I just don't think they care.
You may well be right about that. When he says that it wasn't raining during the inauguration speech and people can actually feel the raindrops landing on their head, I'm just intrigued to know whether or not psychologically, as a long-term confidant, you think he's sort of gaming everybody, or whether he somehow puts himself in a position where he's persuaded himself that what he wants to be true is true.
Well, having gone to the inauguration, having taken the occasion to finally wear a morning suit, something I've wanted to do my entire life, I must tell you, it didn't rain. There was a nanosecond in which there were a sprinkling of raindrops. It was over in less than 2 minutes. I know, because my wife didn't want to get drenched.
Okay.
So I think in this case, he's right.
But not on the date of arrival in Scotland. Roger Stone, congratulations on the morning suit, and many thanks indeed to you. I'm joined now by Anne Applebaum, the foreign affairs expert and columnist for the Washington Post. Are you as upbeat as Mr. Stone about the Trump?
Funny enough, Mr. Stone sounded somewhat less upbeat than I might have thought he was, given that he was how much he supported him. I'm holding fire. I'm waiting to see what happens.
And what would be good news? I mean, what would reassure you? What would sort of remove your conniptions?
What would reassure me, unfortunately, is if Trump announced that he'd thought it through, he'd listened to his cabinet, he'd spoken to experts, he'd talked to people in the State Department, he'd spoken to people in other cabinet departments, and he decided, for example, that the liberal international order and the rule of law and the rules-based world order that Theresa May spoke about, that these are things worth preserving, and he's decided to preserve them.
And
that would reassure me.
And at that point, his core support goes absolutely nuts, right?
I don't know, because I'm not sure what his core support was voting for him for. So I'm not sure that...
the wall and the ban on Muslims and all of the other slogans.
Even some indications that his core support always thought that the wall was a metaphor. You know, whether he really builds the wall or doesn't build the wall, it's not clear how much that matters. I mean, it clearly matters to some people. But everybody, I'm not sure.
Is there a danger now? It's such a nascent regime. Is there a danger that everybody is hearing what they want to hear, and that in fact he does move around quite a lot, and possibly even today we may have seen evidence that his opinion can be in some way changed by the last person who made an impression on him? So Theresa May very keen to come out and talk about NATO, Russian sanctions. If he's in a room with somebody a little more hawkish tomorrow or a little more protectionist, he may switch again.
One of the techniques he used to win the elections, and this you can show when you look at the way they used Facebook and his team used the internet, is they would put out dozens of different messages, some contradictory, some variations on the same thing, aimed at different audiences. And as you say, people heard what they wanted to hear, and they screened out what they didn't want to hear.
And they still are, including statesmen.
And they still are, and
Yes.
people aren't used to that. You know, you and I aren't used to it, others in public life aren't used to it, and are confused by it. We find it contradictory. But yes, it was an election technique, and it did help him get elected. The question is now, can it help him rule? I mean, for example, those statements he made about the wall and building the wall and making Mexico pay for the wall, okay, well, what has happened? He's destroyed relationships with one of America's most important allies and trading partners. The peso has crashed. Investment has stopped in Mexico. People believe that the border may come back, NAFTA may be abrogated. And that means not just Mexican businesses, but hundreds and hundreds of American businesses which trade back and forth across the border will be in trouble. Well, you know, they all heard some messages that he was sending to some people, and those have now had effects in real life. So now that he's president, that method of sort of strewing messages out there and letting them sink into wherever they might is going to have real effects in the real world, and they may not be pleasant.
Do you feel Theresa May had much choice in trying to get to the front of the queue and, as we saw today, succeeding?
I mean, Theresa May's visit to Washington, to me, was a real indication of how much more restricted Britain's choices are and how much less sovereignty, in a way, Britain has than it used to. You know, Britain really has no choice. She politically needs somewhere she can go when Britain leaves the EU. She needs someone who she can point to as a partner. I had worried that one of her partners might be Russia or China or Turkey, simply because
she's
she
in
would
Turkey next.
Well, she would need she needs somebody right outside of the periphery, and so she might go to the sort of anti-democratic world. And now Trump has, as like a blessing from the sky, has come and given her this opportunity. But almost everything she said in her speech yesterday, and almost everything she said about global Britain in the last few days, contradicts directly what Trump has said.
But hey, they held hands. Anne Applebaum, thank you very much indeed.
I've been